Literacy among slaves. Slavery was very prominent in 16th to 18th century, having appeared in America in the 17th century. The antebellum South, before the Civil War, was known for its many plantations and focus on slavery. African Americans were sent from Africa to be sold and used as labor on the fields to produce a bunch of cash crops to be sold for profit. African Americans at the time had no prior education and knew little amounts of information. However, those who were lucky were taught a little bit on how to read and write. According to Violet J. Harris's article titled African American Conceptions of Literacy, A Historical Perspective, only 15 to 20% of African Americans could read. Learning how to read and write proved to be very important to many African Americans, and the chance for freedom and success were much more prevalent with them. Frederick Douglass was an important figure in the 17th–18th century. He spent most of his time confined to a plantation when he was growing up, until eventually he escaped. His story is very interesting. He escaped on a train and didn't have his free papers that were required to travel as a free man. It was up to the conductor to allow him to pass, and the conductor glanced at his papers not that closely, which Douglass was very happy about. He got into town and was a free man and was set to do what he wanted to do for the first time. He ended up writing how he escaped slavery on the train, and second time a years later he ended up leaving a detailed account for how he did it and who specifically helped him on his path to freedom. He had a bit of help from the people he talked to, but other than that, he was on his own for learning. He learned how to read and write, and that provided to be a great help on his great escape. Eventually learning how to read and write better, and he learned thousands of other things that really made Frederick Douglass an iconic figure to look at. Virginia, Alabama, Louisiana, and North Carolina all established laws that would forbid slaves from learning how to read and write. This was feared because knowledge was the key to figuring out why abolitionist papers or what abolitionist papers were saying, and gave clues on ways to escape and rebel against their plantation owners. Laws were passed that disallowed teaching to be done in these states. If white owners were caught teaching their slaves, they were punished by a written fine of $100 or imprisonment for a short amount of time. It brings up the question, why would white owners teach their slaves to read and write? Were they trying to help appease them by giving them education so they'd stay loyal to working in the fields? It's a very interesting to bridge this connection and figure out why plantation owners would do this. Slaves often learned how to read and write by other African Americans and communicating with them when they were working out in the fields. Some of the free slaves ended up opening schools that were very popular, and whites were discouraged to teach some of the slaves, but yet some of them did it anyway. Importance of education. People who can read and write are able to create arguments, share opinions, and become more knowledgeable, and perform day-to-day tasks, according to Regan Gary. Education teaches people the ways of life and provides a base to build more intellect on. With the ability to start learning education early, it provides the chains to learn more and more in depth. African Americans at the time were not given this right and restricted all access of education. Education would potentially open new doors for African Americans that let them figure out ways to escape or rebel. Because field owners did not want this, they were not allowed to teach their workers anything. They had to live in huts with their families and continue the long, extensive workday out in the field. Communication was also a huge fear with landowners. If African Americans learned how to speak with each other, it would provide a new realm for more rebellious activities that they were afraid of, just like Frederick Douglass and how he escaped. Some of the dangers of education: literacy holds the ability to be free, provides opportunities to rebel, communication with all the slaves in the plantation, and the potential to learn about abolitionist movements and that were going around at the time. Some of the consequences were there were a lot of consequences that came with learning knowledge. For example, African Americans were often left humiliated or severely tortured because of knowledge. This is a prime reason why plantation and landowners did not want slaves to learn, was because the fear they would escape and stop working and group up against the landowners. Literacy and religion. Christianity was very popular among the African Americans during the time. Slaves didn't start getting into religion until the 1600s, when they were mixing their beliefs in Africa with that of Christians here in the United States. Education for religion was not prevented by African Americans. Religion was very difficult to be figured out by many plantation owners of which religion should they be. There was a bunch of arguments and undecided reasons of what they should do or what they shouldn't do. Religion ended up being undecided, and many plantation owners were against the idea of having African Americans learn religion because they thought religion would open up basically a new way for freedom, and which would allow them to escape, just like education would.